All right, well, so I already made a couple videos and they wouldn't upload. So I'm redoing what I've just spent several hours doing. So pardon me if I'm a little luster here and perhaps not so detailed as I was the first time, although you would never know, because I just wasted about an hour of my time making videos that wouldn't load. So let's try this again. I'm going to leave off my lecture on Stoicism. Perhaps we'll cover that in class, but I need to get these done today. So I'm going to walk us through chapter 5. If you recall, chapter 4, we dealt with the Greeks through Hellenism. And so now we will talk about chapter 5, which is entitled The Roman Republic. Notice, if you will, this is the book that I have, right? And there's the title. Obviously, is this backwards to you guys? It looks backwards to me. These refer to the subtopics that are throughout the chapter. And this is a little kind of overview. Really, the little, what do you call, outlines that I give you is sort of this kind of thing. Point is, it'll really help you to understand if you pay attention to this for a little bit. It'll help you understand what the whole of the chapter is about. So in this one, we're going to look at basically the rise and fall of Rome. Think of it like this. Nations or cultures, much like people, they're born, they grow, they reach sort of like an adolescent age where they expand and they're strong. Then they sort of reach into, become adults and sort of are more interested in, stability and that sort of thing, and then fall into old age and finally die. That's kind of how empires go as well. So we're going to talk about in this chapter is the emergence of Rome till it becomes a pretty sizable power, and then it's the seeds of its destruction. This chapter is not going to get into the fall of Rome, but we'll get to the fall of the Republic. Now, what do you mean by Republic? Look, if you will, on page 86, 87. Your book talks about the emergence of Rome. To make a long story short, Rome initially was in an area dominated by a people called the Etruscans. If you remember back to the Greeks, we talked about the Mycenaeans and Minoans as sort of precursor civilizations to the Greeks. For the Romans, it was the Etruscans. There's a couple of myths about where Rome came from, which we can kind of skip over for the most part. Okay, what is significant, and this shows up on page 87, was that in 509 BC, the aristocrats of Rome, that is, the wealthier landowners, got together and fought not a very big, but nevertheless a revolution against their Etruscan king. His name was Tarquinius Superbus. To make a long story short, in 509 BC, then, Rome became a republic. Rather than create a kingship, rather than make one of their own king, what the Romans decided was to create instead a senate. And that senate was comprised of the wealthy, noble, leading families of the time. And from that senate, all other magistrates and offices were originated. So in other words, Rome set up a republic, and republic is a Latin term which means the people's affairs. Res means things or affairs. Publica means public. So a republic is a government of, by, and for the people. In other words, the Senate is for the affairs of the people. All right, and this government was to continue for the next 500 years until civil war and chaos led Rome to a point in its history when only one man could keep peace and stability. And so Rome, by the end of this chapter, is no longer a republic, but is ruled by one man, an emperor. But anyway, that's down the road. So early Rome, 87, 88, 89. Early in Rome's history, if you look on page 88, the period from 509 to 264, in your book called The Roman Republic, was a time in which that government that started out very small in a tiny little city-state called Rome, which was very insignificant, came to sort of grow and dominate its neighbors and dominate the region and eventually dominate the entire Italian peninsula. And you get a little map somewhere. Yeah, you see map on 91, but you all know what Italy looks like. And Rome expanded and conquered and took over all of those territories. And so it eventually came to encompass all of the Italian peninsula. Okay. Now, two important factors that are going on. So while Rome is expanding, and obviously it is doing so through its military, the military is becoming stronger, it's more stable, etc. But two things happen. One, its government becomes more complex. And so you have a system of magistracies. Your book talks about them: consuls, praetors, aediles, and quaestors. And those were the four main functions of government, the four main titles. There were several of each of them. And you could think of those guys as sort of like, we talk about secretaries in our culture, right? So the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Education, etc. And so those guys would be in charge of various, responsibilities, and they would have rather large staffs of bureaucrats underneath of them. Okay, so that's basically how the democracy, the republic, was run. And all of those people were chosen from the Senate, at least at first. That is, you had to be a landowner and of the noble class in order to serve in the Senate and to be elected to those positions. However, over time, what happened is the people demanded more and more of a say, because in this period there were several times of violence when the people would riot over food shortages and that sort of thing. And you had again another gap between rich and poor that was just beginning, and it was called the struggle of the orders. If you see on the very bottom of page 88, your book talks about the patricians and the plebeians. Patricians were the nobles who owned things. The plebeians were those who worked for them. When times were fine and everyone was happy, these two got along decently enough. However, in times of shortage, in times of famine, there would be great tension between them. So what developed, where does it show this in your book? I don't know, it's somewhere. What developed is that the patricians gave the plebs their own council. So instead of the Senate, they got what was called the concilium plebis. In other words, the council of the plebs. And eventually they got a position called the tribune. And this was a guy who was basically, the tribune of the plebs was sort of like the president of the poor people. So imagine if we had, the president of the rich people, the consul, and the president of the poor people, the tribune. Over time, however, what started to happen was that the tribune became very politically powerful unofficially. And rich people, that is the patricians, began to become tribunes. And it was a way for them to get power over the Senate. And very often they did not have the interests of the poor people in mind. So it became a political tool, really. And we'll get to that in a little while. But anyways, so that's going on. So you've got a growing tension between the patricians and the plebs. You have a growing government that becomes more complex and in need of good trained bureaucrats. And then you also have physically the empire expanding throughout Italy. So those things are going on until 264. This shows up on page 90. And in 264 BC, what happens is Rome has expanded throughout the entire Italian peninsula, and as such becomes a regional power. But at the time, the regional power was a city-state in North Africa called Carthage. Now, if you recall, when we were talking about Greece in the last chapter, right, we had said that the Greeks fought a huge war against Persia, if you recall. And after defeating the Persians, the Greeks emerged as the the dominant power in the Mediterranean region. And then only shortly thereafter, after their success, right, if you recall, they destroyed each other in the Peloponnesian War. But anyway, so the Romans in 264 encountered their Persia, so to speak, with Carthage. And there was a series of wars called the Punic Wars, which lasted, I think, about 100 years or so. And through these series, there's three waves, really, the first, second, and third Punic Wars. Through these series of wars, what happens is Rome ultimately emerges as the most powerful nation in the region, and Carthage is utterly destroyed. You may have heard of the famous Hannibal, that's a Carthaginian general, and he brought a whole bunch of elephants across the Alps to invade northern Italy and all this kind of stuff. But anyways, so we're not going to get too heavy into the details of the war, but if you recall that story, it refers to this period in history. So Rome emerges victorious. Now, what that means is, one, now they have world leadership, but two, it also means a lot of wealth comes in to the Republic. Because in these days, when you conquer people, you take taxes from them, they pay you tribute. And what happened in the case of Carthage is they sold all of these, all the citizens off as slaves. So a lot of money started coming into Rome because of Carthage, and also because of Rome's dominant position after Carthage. So it took leadership away. So all this wealth that comes in begins to change the economy a little bit. And obviously, right, if tons of money is coming in, the people who are already rich are positioned to exploit the new wealth. Right? I mean, think of it this way, right? Right now you could say, let's say the housing market recently tanked, right? A lot of people made a lot of money in the United States if they already had money, right? And that's sort of how these windfalls go. They never fully trickle down. So anyways, that's one of the consequences of the Punic Wars. After the Punic Wars, society began to change a little bit in Rome, and your book talks about this a little bit. Traditionally, Roman society was based on the family, with the father firmly in charge, the paterfamilias he is often called. And that continued on as in this period. However, one of the big things is you had a lot of slaves coming in after the Punic Wars. And slaves were only able to be afforded by the wealthy, and they were another way to increase the wealth of the wealthy kind of concept. So again, you get a growing gap between rich and poor, right? And your book talks about what life was like in the Roman family. It talks about literature. I'm going to kind of skip that over for the most part. Sadly, there's just not enough time for us to appreciate Roman literature. But I think their history is instructive, so I want to kind of spend a little bit more time there. So look, if you will, on page 100, the decline and fall of the Roman Republic. So here's the deal. Two things happened to Rome in the 1st century BC. So remember that gap between rich and poor. So as all these lands were acquired by Roman conquest, initially the idea was that they would give these lands to veterans to settle on so that they could have little farms to support themselves, and they would relocate the urban poor. Rome was growing as a city of great wealth and great poverty at the same time. So the idea was, well, we conquer these lands from these people, kill the people, take their land, and then give the land to veterans and the poor. And it did for a while. However, rich people realized that they could get their hands on these chunks of land, so the public land was really not public. It was bought up by rich people who then sold it and made money. The result was by about 150 or 100 BC, there were a lot of people in Rome who were far too poor to support themselves and became dependent on handouts, welfare state kind of thing. And so Tiberius Gracchus comes along, who is a senator, who is from a patrician family. And he realizes if you don't give people the means to support themselves, eventually Rome will fall into chaos, anarchy, and mob rule as the poor get poorer and more angry. The last thing you want is lots of poor, angry people who have nothing to do hanging around concentrated in big cities. So, anyways, Gracchus decides, well, why don't we enforce the law that said that rich people could only own so much public land? And that law had been ignored. And so he said, we'll do that. Thereby freeing up more land to distribute to the veterans and the poor people so that they could support themselves. There's no jobs in these days. I mean, you can't just go to the city and get a job like you can in America. You had to have a chunk of land to be self-sufficient. So anyways, that's what he tries, and he is clubbed to death in his offices by sections of the patrician senators who are, obviously guarding their wealth. Okay. What that does is it unleashes, to make a long story short, a whole series of civil wars, and it creates the precedent of violence in politics. Another episode, your book talks about Marius and Sulla. To make a long story short, it's a squabble between two generals over who should go and fight a war. And Marius is a general who thinks he should, but the Senate changes his mind, and Marius marches his army on Rome itself. So for the first time in Roman history, a general actually invades Rome and forces the Senate to do something. Sulla, another Roman general, then comes to the aid of Rome and fights Marius. And so now you have two Roman generals fighting each other with Roman armies and Roman citizens over who should have the title of imperator, in other words, general in charge of this one area. Sulla takes over, becomes dictator, and does something, when was this, 89 AD or something? 81, I forget, it doesn't matter. Does something precedent setting. What he does is he writes a list of all the people that are against him, that fought against him, and says that their property can be confiscated and they can be murdered. And that's exactly what happens. And hundreds of wealthy Roman citizens are proscribed. In other words, written on a list that the poor people can then kill and loot their property. So that precedent is started by Sulla. Shortly after that, things aren't going so well in Rome when you have generals attacking the mother country, and its citizens are being looted. And so what happens is three prominent men come together and say, we are going to be in charge. And that is Pompey, Julius Caesar, and Crassus. And these three guys realize that the Senate cannot maintain order anymore because there's too much violence, there's too much intrigue against one another. And so they say that we'll rule in place of the Senate. And that's what happens. And they have a sort of like a three-man rule. It's called triumvirate. However, they go to war against each other. It works for a little while, but they all become ambitious. Until, to make a long story short, Julius Caesar is able to defeat the other two, and he becomes the sole strong guy in all of Rome. And then he's murdered in 44 BC by a bunch of senators in the Senate. Stabbed to death in the Senate. Alright, the senators thought that they had finally defeated all of this stuff and could maintain senatorial control over Rome. Not so much. Because Caesar's nephew and people loyal to him created an army, and the senators who murdered him created an army, and they fight yet another civil war, and the senators lose. Brutus and Cassius, if you remember anything from the play of Julius Caesar. And so Caesar's guys win. They are Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Caesar's nephew, Octavian. And they set up a triumvirate just like Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. And their triumvirate goes exactly the same way that the other one did. They start fighting among themselves. At the end of the day, Octavian defeats them all and emerges as the last man standing. He changes his name to Augustus. He occupies Rome with his army. And at this point, he has the Senate declare him dictator for life, and the people are willing to put up with it because they've had about 100 years of constant civil war, and quite honestly, there's not many people left who could oppose him anyway. So in 27 BC, he has himself declared emperor, and that is the end of the Republic, and Rome really enters a new phase. By no means is Rome done. The empire will continue to thrive under Augustus and the other emperors. But it's no longer the traditional Rome that was created back in 509. It is now a completely different type of government. And I need to keep these things under 20 minutes, I think. I think that's why my last one didn't upload. It was too long. So I'm going to say so long now. This will suffice for chapter 5, and look for chapter 6.